Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of Mr. American's Moments in Geography. We're going to continue our discussion on China today. We're going to look a little bit more at China's culture. So what are we going to be able to do today? We're going to call this section Dynasties to Communism, because there's a lot of history in between these two segments and a lot of culture to talk about as well. But we're going to be able to identify some of those cultural elements of China. We're going to talk about some of those historical, we'll talk about religion, certainly get into governments and ideas along with that, and then we'll close things out with a little bit of food. And we'll even throw in some architecture in there as well. So just to kind of preface everything, when we break down the culture of China, about 92% would be identifying as what we call Han Chinese. Now, in that 92% is still a lot of ethnic diversity. But even outside of the Han Chinese, the other 8% is 55 other ethnic groups. So China's a very diverse place, despite the fact that the vast majority shares a very common ancestry and a very common ethnic group. So let's get into some of China's history. And this is by no means going to be a complete list. We could dedicate an entire class to Chinese history and still only scratch the surface. It's a very fascinating culture, and certainly we could spend an entire year learning about Chinese history. And you can. There are some really great classes out there to take, especially in university or college settings. But for our purposes, we're kind of just going to give a basic introduction. So certainly throughout much of China's history, you've got the presence of these dynasties. And these dynasties really were ruled by emperors and lasted until the 1900s. And again, some of these dynasties last for a very long time. They fall for a variety of different reasons, but typically with a different group coming to power and then their lineage following them. But again, you've got this in place until basically the 20th century, the 1900s. And throughout its history, China has either been very well connected through things like trade, through like the Silk Road, for example, or they've been isolated. And that isolation has been both made by them, like the Great Wall, and we'll talk a little bit in class about why this was built and certainly get into its importance in history. And then certainly also natural obstacles, whether it's the mountains or the deserts. They all certainly played a role in that history of isolation within China. But again, there's been a variety of different realities as far as being isolated or being well connected. Depends on what period in Chinese history you're talking about. And certainly throughout that history, you've seen the development and the spread of religions and philosophies. And probably one of the most famous Chinese philosopher is Confucius, also known as, and I apologize if I mispronounce this, but the Confucius. And his idea was that it starts with the family, goes from the family to the community to the nation. So that if a family is, running well and working the way it should, that will help the community run the way it should, which will help the nation run the way it should. And so some of those key ideas, again, I know for some of my students this may be something that you would resist, but again, the whole idea of children obeying their parents and basically being parents helping to raise children, children serving their parents, and again, living in harmony within that family. And then, of course, respect for the elderly and the wisdom that comes with that age. Certainly another, Lao Tzu is another famous example. He helps usher in Taoism, sometimes called Taoism. In class, we'll talk a little bit about the yin and yang and how life is a balance of those two. But essentially, at the core of Taoism is this idea of living simply, but also living in harmony with nature and having to have that balance. You'll also see throughout the history, and we'll talk a little bit about calligraphy a little bit later, but you'll see paper and ink. Of course, we'll see the importance of silk. Certainly the compass was first developed here. The Chinese are the first ones to create printed books. A lot of credit gets given to the Europeans, but the Chinese did it first. And so it should certainly be noted that while theirs is going to look different than the Europeans, they are the first ones to essentially have that within their culture. Certainly gunpowder also gets developed here along with fireworks. So certainly a lot of cultural elements there. Also want to get a little bit into religion too. Probably the majority religion that you'll find in China is Buddhism. Certainly begins with Siddhartha Gautama, who becomes the Buddha. And at the center, certainly, of Buddhism are practices like meditation, the seeking of wisdom, and the idea of developing morality. And there's the Eightfold Path and the Four Noble Truths, which I want to highlight here. So the Four Noble Truths, the first noble truth is life is full of suffering. And if you've lived for any amount of time, you'll know that life does have suffering in it, and that's a fact of life. Doesn't necessarily have to define your life, but you do need to know that there is some suffering in life. Certainly the second one also is that suffering comes from this idea of desire or wanting. And that can be both a physical desire or a mental desire or an emotional or spiritual desire. But the idea is that is the center of our suffering. That is why we suffer. The third noble truth is the idea that suffering stops when your desire and your wanting stops. And you do that, again, in order to stop that desire and that want, you need to follow the Eightfold Path. And so the two are certainly very connected to each other. But a lot of wisdom already in those Four Noble Truths, and the idea that sometimes we don't suffer as much when we are able to eliminate and not let our wants and desires run our lives. When we look at the Eightfold Path in Buddhism, the first on the list is having the correct view. This is an accurate understanding of the nature of things, and again, that comes with wisdom, specifically centered around the Four Noble Truths, which again, we just talked about. Having the correct intention, avoiding thoughts of attachment, hatred, as well as harmful intent towards people. Having the correct speech. Essentially, this is when you use your words for good. You're refraining from verbal misdeeds, things like lying, divisive speech, harsh speech, or senseless speech, stuff that isn't productive. Choosing your words carefully might be another way to think about that. Having the correct action, certainly not getting involved in physical misdeeds such as killing, stealing, or sexual misconduct. And again, if these sound familiar, you're going to see some similarities to some other religions that we talked about. Having the correct livelihood. In this, you avoid trades or jobs that are directly or indirectly in harming people. So some examples that were included were selling people into slavery, selling weapons, or selling animals to slaughter, selling or creating intoxicants or different poisons, things that can hurt people. The sixth one gets into this idea of, having the correct effort. This is the idea that kind of in a way you don't waste your time with negative states of mind. So you try to abandon states of mind that have already arisen. So not letting the past bring you down in things that you're dwelling in, preventing negative states that currently arise in you. And again, you can do this through meditation or through different processes, trying to control your state of mind. Certainly also trying to sustain positive states that have already arisen. So again, continuing the positive effort, trying to eliminate those negative states of mind. Again, easier said than done. That's why this is a process. That's why reincarnation is certainly a part of this. Also, certainly having the correct mindfulness. And again, this is where largely meditation can come in. It's the awareness of your body, certainly your feelings, thought, as well as the phenomena like the constituents of the existing world. So in some ways, being aware of what influences you and controlling the influence that it has on you. And the last thing is just having the correct concentration. Again, being single-minded towards the goal, especially in understanding the Four Noble Truths. So, coming back to China, certainly when it comes to communist China, there's a forced trade during the 1800s. And then when you hit 1911, you hit a very important mark. Dr. Sun Yat-sen overthrows the last emperor of China. And it's actually after that point that China becomes a republic. But after World War II, after fighting with the Allies against Japan in the Pacific, you saw the rising of two different forces. You saw the nationalists and you saw the communists. And in a way, these are also called the White Army and the Red Army. The White Army being the nationalists, the Red Army, of course, being the communists. And they represent certainly the power struggle that existed in the world at the time. And again, we're talking about the Cold War era. When you look at the People's Republic of China, your leader is Mao Zedong. You have an economy that's communist. So from our different types that we talked about at the beginning, that would be purely a command economy. Certainly your foreign influence there is the USSR. And they control most of the mainland. Then you've got the Republic of China, what we sometimes refer to as Taiwan today. Leader there is, and again, I apologize if I mispronounce these names, Chiang Kai-shek. It's definitely an economy that's based on capitalism. So you got probably a market/mixed economy in there, more likely a mixed. Certainly foreign influence there is the United States. Again, they're the White Army. They control the island. So as you hit 1949, you see this reality that there are two Chinas. Again, People's Republic of China and then the Republic of China. Again, China, Taiwan. And so certainly in class we'll get into this, and I've got some great videos to show you. But certainly looking at why China built the Great Wall in its history, and certainly does the U.S. and other nations recognize Taiwan? Who does, who doesn't, as an independent nation, or do they see it as a part of China? I got a couple of great quotes here that kind of highlight the two different points of view, including from Colin Powell as well as Cheng Shu-bian. China's government and certainly their society. Again, everything changes in 1949 as the government takes over. You see communism and the Red Army basically claim everything. Certainly as part of communism, they control the lands, they control the factories, all the means of production. You also saw a lot of individual rights being lost here, in particular freedom of speech, but certainly also to some degree, freedom of religion. The official religion in communism is atheism. So certainly those who were seen as opposing, sometimes also referred to as the collectives, were often killed. And so the price that you paid for speaking out against the government. Deng Xiaoping, again, I apologize if I mispronounced that. He's going to start to open up China. Now this begins partially under the Nixon administration and gets continued under Ford and certainly from other presidents afterwards, but it was more a economic opening of China as opposed to a political. And while we talked certainly about some of that privatization that's occurring in agriculture as well as in the privates, in business the private sector governments, you aren't seeing necessarily an opening up of like social or political rights that come with that. Probably one of the best examples we have from Chinese history of some of these struggles is Tiananmen Square, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in class. That's the picture that's in the upper left-hand corner. Again, a protest that ended with arrests as well as, unfortunately, some people dying. But in class, we'll talk a little bit about what human rights are and what some of those human rights issues that China faces today. A lot of them center around, again, the idea of freedom of speech, freedom of the press as well. Certainly Tibet, this is an ongoing issue that has some religious undertones, especially with the Dalai Lama. But again, you'll see that in the lower left-hand corner, as well as the Uyghur province. Again, this is a group of people who are majority Muslim and certainly have been the target of the Chinese government in recent years, including detention camps. Kind of rounding out Chinese culture, certainly China is known for its traditional art, certainly its love of nature, Certainly one of the more traditional forms of art is calligraphy, which often is done with, again, ink and paper. You certainly also will see bronze casting as a very common form of Chinese art. My apologies. Also, certainly porcelain, especially as you go throughout the dynasties. As far as the architecture of China goes, you're going to see a really cool combination of modern as well as traditional buildings. For students in my class, we're going to watch a great video, and you can certainly find it on YouTube too. But it's about how pagodas are able to withstand earthquakes. So pagoda, like you might see in China or actually in Japan as well. Certainly they both would have influenced each other, but how they have withstood earthquakes for centuries. So very cool engineering going on there. And then, of course, food. For those of you who are listening in the United States, this is going to be very different than the Chinese food that you've probably had. Like in a restaurant, for example. But it ranges very differently depending on the region, the style of food, the spices that you use. Again, along the coast, you're going to see a lot more of that seafood, shellfish, fish, and other sources, certainly. You'll certainly see different spices like hot spices in central China. You'll see different cooking styles, including stir-frying. But a lot of Chinese cooking usually involves tools like woks, for example, and certainly cooking at high temperatures, certainly with a little bit of oil in the process, and using vegetables and meat and noodles and a variety of different ingredients. So that's going to wrap up our video for today. Certainly, like we've mentioned in class, food is at the center of a lot of life in China. In fact, even some business dealings aren't complete until there's a kind of a celebratory banquet to kind of seal the deal. And so certainly plays an important role in Chinese culture. That's going to wrap up our discussion on China. We'll get into some of the neighbors of China, including Mongolia, in our next video. Until then, though, thank you for listening. We'll see you on the next edition of Mr. Merrigan's Moments in Geography.